So, starting the Torah portion of Vayigash, not just starting it, but actually reading the whole thing this week. And Vayigash, of course, is the third in the Yosef and his brothers series, probably the third and final installment, you might call it, because in Parshas Vayeshev is when he is sold. And in Parshas Miketz is when he interprets the dreams, and then is made the viceroy of Egypt, and the brothers come to him, and he sets them up with Binyamin, arresting Binyamin. And of course, in this week's Parsha is where Yehuda stands up for Binyamin. He reveals his identity, and he invites his family to come down to Egypt and for him to take care of them there. So we're going to learn a few of the verses in the Parsha, and we'll discuss them and what we can learn from them. One interesting point that we have in this discussion, in today's discussion, is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe focuses on the places where the reader finishes reading on Shabbos. You know, the Torah portion is divided into 7 readings. The Kohen gets the first Aliyah, if there is a Kohen. The Levi gets the next Aliyah, if there's a Levi. And then 5 Yisraelim, non-Kohanim or Leviim, that is, get the next 5 Aliyahs. And that pretty much rounds up the 7 Aliyahs. And it's not clear exactly who decided where each Aliyah ends and the next one begins. Seems to have kind of developed over the centuries, and I'm not even sure when it became official. But when the printing press was invented back in the 1300s, and they started printing Chumashim, so they printed where the Aliyahs end, and that's probably when it became uniform. Like, I imagine until the Chumashim were printed, there was no uniformity as to where people stopped exactly, because there's no halacha about it. The halacha, the law says that each aliyah has to be at least 3 verses, and that you cannot stop at a negative point. You don't want like a bad taste in people's mouths when they stop. And you also cannot stop within 3 verses of the end of a paragraph. The Torah is divided into paragraphs where there's a space in between the different paragraphs. And you cannot stop within 3 of that paragraph break. So not 1 before the paragraph break, not 2 before the paragraph break, nor 1 after or 2 after. But if you want to stop at the paragraph break, that's fine. Or if you want to stop 3 before, 3 after, that's also fine. But other than that, there's no rules. So you could, stop in any number of places. But as I said, the custom developed somehow that all congregations more or less stop at those 6 stopping points. Well, the last one is predetermined because that's the end of the parsha. But the other 6 are just what people do, and it has become uniform. But the commentaries don't really focus so much on why that is a stopping point. It's usually obvious. It's a good point to stop and whatever. But here, the Rebbe talks about why we stop where we stop. Any questions before we continue? I know you're muted, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and or raise your hand or type in any questions you have.
Does it have anything to do with the time spent or not? Let's see, a certain part of the services is supposed to be dedicated to such and such thing, and certain time should be, because it depends, everybody is reading differently, and every subject has a little different time span.
Well, in terms of everybody reading differently, this reading is done by the Baal Koreh, by the one who reads from the Torah, and the congregation is expected to be listening. Of course, it's a good thing to have a chumash and to follow the reader so that you don't miss a word and you know what's going on and whatever. But the intention was originally to actually listen to what he's saying. Of course, a person who doesn't understand Hebrew and wants to read the English, that's also fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But they certainly did not give more time for more complicated subjects, because basically the time allotted for it is as long as it takes the reader to read. So basically you get the basic understanding just from hearing it and hopefully knowing the language, or nowadays reading the translation. As far as the commentaries and the deeper meanings, that's why we're here. That's why you have a whole week in advance to study up on it and afterwards or whatever.
My question was because you mentioned that the stop should be at a certain point that
Right.
somehow regulated by the text in the book. That's why, I thought, is it any caps of what is the time spent for the entire reading, or it just mostly connected with the text? How much, what was written and what's supposed to be read?
It's all about the text. It's all about the amount of text in that particular parsha. The biggest parsha, if I'm not mistaken, containing 176 verses. The smallest parsha containing 30 verses, which is interesting how varied they can be. But it's totally dependent on the size of the text, perhaps with the exception of one or two readings which are supposed to be read faster. And those are the klalos, the parts of the Torah where there are curses that are associated with those that don't observe the Torah and go against Hashem. So there's sections that have very disturbing curses. So the custom in many communities is that the reader reads that quickly, just because we kind of want to be done with them already. So other than that, hopefully the reader is not reading too fast, and they're all more or less the same.
And there are people who are at, let's say, at time of the reading, they don't have any input, or it's no discussion, or it's no commentaries, or nothing in between. It's just a straight reading of the Torah text.
So originally, there was a system in which each verse would be translated. As the verse was read, first the verse would be read, and then somebody else besides the reader would translate the verse into Aramaic. Aramaic at that time was the spoken language both in Babylonia and in Israel. And that went on for many centuries, perhaps even a millennia. I couldn't tell you exactly how long for. But the reason that went out of that fell into disuse, that system, is because people no longer speak Aramaic. So rather than have somebody translate it into a language, that we don't understand, we just keep it in the Hebrew, which some people understand, some people don't. But there is no longer any one translation that will be good for everybody. We're here in America, but that's not going to help the Jews in South America, and it's not going to help the Jews in Russia or wherever else they are. So there's no uniform translation anymore, and therefore we just read it, and people who need the translation, hopefully can have their own chumash and can follow that along.
Okay, thank you.
Rabbi?
My pleasure. One second. Unless you happen to be in a Yemenite shul, The Yemenites are the only people till this day that I'm aware of that actually still translate into Aramaic. I used to daven in a shul in Yerushalayim called Mayanot, and it was located right near a Yemenite shul. And we used to hear how they had a child translate each verse. The reader was an adult, but the translator does not have to be an adult, and it was usually a child. So that's the only time I ever heard that. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I didn't understand how what's the logic behind how they break up the parsha, because there's always the same number of aliyot.
Exactly. There's always the same number of aliyahs.
But there is such a big difference in size of the parsha.
Yes.
So how do they decide? And I don't see usually that there is the same size for each aliyah in a parsha. It can be 2-line aliyah and it can be a 20-line aliyah.
That is very true. You actually can have 2 lines because you need a minimum of 3 verses.
Maybe, okay, maybe 3.
Right. But other than that, it's very true that it's not so clear why the aliyahs are divided the way they are, because sometimes you have very long aliyahs and sometimes you have very short aliyahs. So why not just make it more uniform and kind of divide it more evenly? It's especially apparent to me in the Torah portion of Bereshit, which generally has very long aliyahs, but the 5th one is like literally 3 verses, maybe 4. So why was it done that way? I don't really know, but I don't even know who to ask. Like even when Mashiach comes and we have the resurrection of the dead, I don't know who to ask, because I don't know who made these aliyah breaks and who decided them and how they were decided. So
it's interesting that the rabbi, the Rabbonim in the Talmud are not talking about it, unless it's lost. Maybe they did.
No, on the contrary, in the Talmud, they didn't have a uniform aliyah break. In the time of the Talmud, different congregations would stop in different places. In fact, every individual reader could decide where they wanted to stop. Because in the time of the Talmud, when you got called for an aliyah, you would read. They called
yourself, right?
You would read, and you could stop wherever you chose, as long as you had read 3 verses, and you were not stopping at a negative point, and you were not stopping within 3 of a paragraph break. That was fine. So you wanted to read more, you could read more, less. Just make sure you leave over something else for the next guy.
Yeah.
But other than that, it was really open.
Yeah, but I don't understand why they don't stop at certain end of a subject. You know, sometimes it's 2-3 subjects spoken about in the aliyah, and others it's just part of a subject.
So actually, today's discussion we're going to have is going to talk about that a little bit in reference to this discussion. In reference to other weeks, we'll have to get to them if and when we do.
Okay.
Very good. So here we go. This is chapter 45, verses 4 through 9. And within these verses, some of them are before the aliyah break and some of them are after, as we're going to see. Vayomer Yosef el Echav. Yosef said to his brothers, Geshuno Elai, approach me, Vayigashu, and they did. Vayomer, and he said, Ani Yosef achichem asher machartem oisim Mitzrayim. I am Yosef, your brother, whom you sold to Egypt. I forgot to put the translation in there for that one. Verse 5, Ve'ata al te'atzvu. Now do not be distressed. Va'ayichar be'einechem, do not reproach yourselves. Ki machartem oisi hena, that you sold me here. Ki lemichya shlachani Elokim lifnechem. Because it was to save lives that Hashem sent me ahead of you. The word michya literally means for feeding. Hashem sent Yosef to Egypt so that he would be able to interpret the dreams of Paroi, so that he could arrange for the grain to be saved from the 7 years of plenty, and they would therefore have enough grain during the 7 years of famine. Now, of course, the brothers could not have known that that was going to happen when they sold him to slavery. So certainly they, it was not the right thing to do for them at that time, certainly. But in retrospect, Yosef is saying to them, you literally saved your own lives and my life and, society at large from a terrible famine. It has now been 2 years that there has been a famine in the land. There is another 5 years that there's not going to be yield from farming, plowing and reaping. Yes, you have a question. Yes.
Yosef is hearing everything that his brothers are saying.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that they are in pain. So why does he have to say, Asher mechaltem oti mitzrayma? Why dig it in? Why not just say, I'm your brother, Hashem sent me here to do, to save lives, etc., etc. And so don't worry about what, don't be distressed about what occurred. Why the dig?
I hear your question.
Because to me, it sounds as if he wants to pain them even more.
I hear your question. I'm open to the answers of the audience if anybody has. Yes.
I would like to say that he doesn't want them to think that he doesn't remember that they sold them. It happened, it's over, but it didn't do any evil, it didn't do any bad to him because God wanted him to be there.
He's spelling it out, basically, you're saying. He's spelling it out. He doesn't want to...
He's mentioning it so they'll see that he's mentioning it. And although it's mentioned, he's not upset about it because God wanted him to be there.
Right. He doesn't want to leave it as an elephant in the room without talking about it. So he addresses it. He says, you sold me to Mitzrayim. That's true. You're all thinking that. But nevertheless, in the end of the day, it was for a salvation. Yes.
Would be kind of a good example that he was trying to give them, that what you did was wrong. And I'm one who forgive you. And I'm one who is above all of this revenge and bad feelings. And the right thing to do is to forgive, and it's your family, you have to help.
Right.
That's not what he says. That's not what he says.
It's not what he says, but the purpose, I think, the meaning of what he explained was, it's just facts are facts. I don't know if he could explain this in any other way, that it is famine ahead. It was really, really a horrible time, before it happened. But he was telling them that it's not in our hands, that it's all kind of predicted and pre-planned without our participation. And that, I show you that even in a bad situation, you could do good and bad. I could be an example of saving you instead of, killing you.
Right.
That's my opinion. I don't know.
I hear it does seem implicit in the verse that he is forgiving them. The fact that he says, don't be upset, Hashem sent you to save me, and so on. So he does seem to be forgiving them. So you're saying that he is stressing, despite the distress that you caused me, obviously, I am, coming forward and not holding against you. I hear that. I'm not really sure. I hear the answers. I'm sure there are other answers discussed by the commentaries, so definitely something to think about. Vayishlacheni Elokim lifnechem. Hashem sent me in front of you. Lasum lachem she'eris ba'aretz, the place for yourselves, survival in the earth. Ulahachis lachem lefleta gedola, and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. That is the end of the second aliyah. If I was reading from the Torah, I would say, Ulachayos lachem lefleta gedola. That's how they finish off. They stretch out the last few words. And to keep you alive for a great deliverance. Okay, then we have the next verse, which continues exactly where we left off with Yosef's speech to his brothers. Ve'ata, and now, verse 8. Loi atem shalachtem oisihena. It wasn't you that sent me here. Ki halekim, it was God himself. This is an important lesson, by the way. Whenever somebody experiences something negative because of somebody else, they should remember it's not really that person. Everything that happens to us is because Hashem wanted it to happen. And even though that person perhaps was the delivery person to give it to us, ultimately it comes from Hashem. And anything that comes from Hashem obviously is part of his plan. It's for a greater good. There's some reason for it. We don't necessarily understand it right away, but there's no reason to be angry about it because it's all from Hashem. Vaisimeni la'ov leparai. He has made me a father to Parai. Ula'odin l'chol beisai, Lord of all of his household. Umoishel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, and a ruler over the entire land of Egypt. Maharu va'alu el avi. Quickly go up to my father. Va'amar to Melav, and tell him, Koi Omar bincha Yosef, so says your son Yosef, Tamani elekim la'odon l'chol Mitzrayim. Hashem has placed me as a master over the entire Egypt. Reda elai al ta'amod, come down to me and do not wait. So, it's a little bit unusual how the aliyahs are divided here, how the readings are divided. Yosef is in the middle of his speech, and he's explaining to them not to hold themselves, not to feel bad about what they did. It was all from Hashem. It was to save them in a great way. And it wasn't you that sent me there, that sent me here. It was Hashem. Hashem made me the patron of Egypt and so on, which is how I'm saving you. So we're literally dividing his speech almost, it's not in mid-sentence, but it's in the middle of his thought. We're dividing it. So that's point number one as to why that division is where it is. Now we're going to skip ahead to verses 26 and 28, because that's where there's another division break. And here's how they go. And this is going on to where the brothers come back to the land of Canaan, and they are going to break the news to their father about Yosef being found. And as we're going to see, he originally doesn't believe them, then he does, and he's very happy. So here goes. Vayagidu loy leimor. They told him, saying, Oid Yosef chai, Yosef is still alive. V'chi hu moshel b'chol eretz Mitzrayim, he is ruling over the entire land of Egypt. Vayafag liboy, and his heart went numb. Ki loy hem in lahem. At first, he could not believe them. The news was too much for him to handle. That after 22 years of not seeing his son, all of a sudden he not only was alive, but was the ruler of Egypt. It just was too much for him to fathom. Vayidabru elav, and they spoke to him, verse 27, as called divrei Yosef asher diber aleihem, all of the words that Yosef had spoken to them. So they explained everything, back and forth about, now they're starting to understand what was going on all along, because Yosef seemed to know about them and about their families, and he had a special interest in Binyamin, and he cared so much about him, and he was always asking about their father and so on. So he really was dropping clues all along as to his identity. They just didn't realize it. And they now explain that to their father. Vayar esa hagolos, and he saw the wagons. Asher shalach Yosef loses oisoi, that Yosef sent to bring him back. Vatechi ruach Yaakov avihem, and the spirit of their father Yaakov was revived. So it's like he came back to life. For 22 years, he was living almost like in a daze. According to our sages, he lost his divine inspiration and prophetic powers. Because when a person is depressed, they cannot experience prophecy. And Yaakov was literally depressed for 22 years. He never got over the loss of his son. Our sages say that Hashem does implant in our nature that we should be able to get over the loss of our loved one, even though it seems impossible at first. But with time, we can find our heart healed. Time goes on, and we learn how to live without that person. And obviously, it's more difficult in the beginning, but eventually we can manage our lives without them. But that's only true when the person is actually passed away. That's when this natural phenomena kicks in. But if the person is alive and we just don't know where they are, like unfortunately is the situation in so many families and missing people and so on, that's when the family doesn't get over it because they have no closure. They don't know what's going on. And that's what it was like for Yaakov for 22 years. And now his spirit was revived. That is the end of the Aliyah. Vatechi ruach Yaakov avihem. That's how I would read it. And the spirit of Yaakov was revived. End of the Aliyah. Vayomer Yisrael. The next Aliyah continues. Yaakov said, Yisrael is another name for Yaakov, right? He had that additional name given to him by the angel. Rav, enough. Oy Yosef beni chai. My son Yosef is alive. Elcha ve'erenu b'terem amos. I will go and see him before he passes away. And this is also a little bit of an unusual place to stop, because we just heard that Yaakov came to understand and believe that his son Yosef was alive. And he says, he exclaims, yes, he is actually alive. Enough suffering, enough sadness. He's alive. I'm going to go and I'm going to see him. So it's also unusual to put a break in between these two verses. So in order to understand this, we're going to discuss another little point in verse 27, where it says, Vayar esaha golos. Actually, I should stop. If anybody has any questions or comments, now's a good time. Yes.
I think once he saw the wagons, he saw that really it's true that Joseph is still alive, because he might have still have, if they came back just with the grain that they went to get, it would be hard for him to believe after all those years that he's alive. But once he saw the wagons, he said, yeah, if he's sending me that many wagons, he's alive and he's doing well.
That's what it seems. Yes, that's what it seems. Although the sages have a different take on that, as we're going to learn in a minute. But that's what it seems like when he saw the wagons. Otherwise, why would somebody send him so many wagons out of the blue to take them? It would be not comprehensible. So this was something he could comprehend. Yes.
But I wanted to say he probably always had a doubt that Joseph died, because there was no body. He only saw a coat.
Yes.
Left.
True.
So I'm sure he always had a doubt whether he's alive or not alive. He wasn't sure.
This is true. And in fact, he alluded to this doubt in the last week's Parsha. In last week's Parsha, when the brothers came back without Shimon, because Yosef kept them imprisoned as collateral to make sure they would come back with Binyamin. So at first they didn't want to send Binyamin. He was afraid he might die on the way. His mother had died on the way. And then Yehuda convinced him. He said, I guarantee him, and so on. And finally Yaakov relented and he agreed. And he says, V'shilach lochem es achichem acher ve'es Binyamin. Hashem will give grace in the eyes of the ruler, and he'll send you your other brother and Binyamin. And he didn't mention what the name of that brother. He didn't say he'll send Shimon back. He said your other brother. And Rashi says that he was alluding to the fact that he was hoping that perhaps they might find Yosef. So yes, it does seem true that all these years he always had some doubt about it. Okay, so going back to verse 27, when he saw the wagons that Yosef had sent to carry him, the spirit of Yaakov came back to life. Now our sages say that the word agolos can be read as a play on word, and it can be referring to the calves. The word for a wagon is agola in Hebrew, and the word for a calf, like a baby cow, is an egla, a calf. Excuse me. And when Yaakov saw the calves that Yosef had sent, that's when the spirit of Yaakov came back to life. What is that? What this means is that right before Yosef took leave of his father for the last time, 22 years earlier when he was 17, they had been studying a section in the Torah about an egla arufa. An egla arufa is a very unique law, very unique mitzvah, which applies when a person is found dead in between cities. And it's an unsolved murder, and we don't know who committed it. So the law says that the members of the great court, the Sanhedrin, the highest court of the land, what was the equivalent of the Supreme Court, should come from Jerusalem and should measure to the nearest town to figure out which is the closest town. And then, based on whichever town is the closest, the sages of that town have to do a whole ceremony. They have to take a calf, a young calf that was never before used for any work, never plowed a field or anything. They take it down to a hard valley in that area. They decapitate the calf, which is then buried there. They wash their hands and they say, we did not spill this man's blood, nor did we see him. and they ask for God to atone for his murder. And one of the ideas is that because this is a very unusual ceremony, people will find out about it. That valley, by the way, could never be used for planting ever again. It had to remain barren. So everybody would know about this. It was like a monument to the unsolved murder case. And people would talk about it and talk about it and talk about it. And hopefully that would lead to solving the murder. They would hopefully figure out who it was. So that is the last discussion, the last Torah discussion that Yosef had with his father before he took leave of him 22 years earlier. And when Yosef was sending his brothers back to bring his father, he told them, in case my father does not believe that it's me, I'm going to give you a sign. And this is something that only me and him would know. So I can't be an imposter. And the sign is that the last thing we were learning is the law of the Egla Arufa, this particular law, the law of the decapitated calf. So when Yaakov saw the agolos, which is not just the wagons, but the discussion of the calf that the brothers told him about, then his spirit came back to life. What we mean here is not just that he found out that Yosef was physically alive. What we also mean is that he found out that Yosef was spiritually alive. Because after 22 years, Yosef was still thinking about the last Torah discussion he had with his father. That means he still cared about Torah. He was still reviewing his studies. This is not something you could remember for 22 years unless it's on your mind. So it was on his mind, obviously, because he cared about it and he was still observing the traditions of the Jewish people and so on. And that's what it means, Vatechi Ruach Yaakov Aviyam. The spirit of Yaakov came back to life to hear that not only was his son physically alive, but that he was emotionally and spiritually still connected to him and on the right path. Okay, so the question is, what is the connection, the inner connection between this particular topic of the calf that is decapitated because somebody is found between cities and the whole story here? There has to be something deeper. Why is it that God arranged that that should be the last discussion that they had? And the discussion also that brought Yaakov to be aware of Yosef still being spiritually healthy. Why should that be the particular discussion that brought that awareness about? That is the question, the $6 million question. Let's open the floor if anybody has any ideas.
Rabbi, before we get to that point,
Yeah.
The Egla Arusa is rather esoteric compared with the remaining Taryag mitzvahs, and yet at this time, it's before Matan Torah. So I find it a little bit unusual that such an esoteric subject would have been discussed between Yaakov and Yosef.
That is, you're adding to the question. You're adding to the question of all things for them to discuss is the Egla Arufa, which is so unusual. And who knows if it ever happened. I mean, I assume it did happen. I mean, there was a Sanhedrin for several centuries, but it's very unusual. Certainly something that did not apply in those days, does not apply today. Of all discussions, why was that the discussion? I mean, the fact that Yaakov and Yosef studied it, I mean, presumably they studied all parts of the Torah. This was his prize pupil, the apple of his eye. Ben Zekunim is what it's called, the son of his old age. So he He really was bonding with him and teaching him whatever he could. So the fact that they learned that, okay. But of all things, for it to be the last thing that they learned, this unusual discussion, there has to be something more to it.
I wanted to give you one answer. I don't know if it's,
Yes.
is that, yeah, I think Eglah Arufa is also a case where they don't know what happened at the crime scene. They don't have proof as to from what town it was or who did the thing.
They do not have proof. They measure the nearest town, and that's the
Yeah.
town that deals with it, but they don't know for sure, and they for sure do not know the perpetrator. If
Right.
they would know the perpetrator, they would bring him to justice, and they wouldn't have to do this whole thing.
Right. So that's the same case here. You know, Jacob didn't know what happened to him, how it happened, or whatever. And I
Okay.
think that's the connection between the two cases,
Okay.
that it's unknown. It was unknown.
Yes, I do hear that. That seems to be a connection. That the man went missing. He didn't go missing in the case of Eglah Arufa. He died in an unknown circumstance, mysterious circumstances. And Yosef also went missing in mysterious circumstances,
Yeah.
unknown as to what happened exactly, where he was, who did it, and so on. So that certainly is a similarity, yes. Anybody else? So I'll just add my own 2 cents. This isn't something the Rebbe says, but something that came to my mind along a similar line is there is some responsibility for the members of the closest town, because perhaps they should have done more to help this person. Because when they say, for example, our hands did not spill his blood and our eyes didn't see. So according to the Talmud, what they're meaning to say is that we didn't see him and not give him a care package, like for food for his travel. If we had seen him, if we had known that he was traveling from our city, we would have given him a care package. And that might have saved his life, because it's possible, again, we don't know why he was killed and who killed him, but it's possible that he was so hungry that he decided to rob somebody else to be able to get food. And it's possible that that person ended up killing him. So that's why they're saying our hands didn't spill his blood. If we had known that he was leaving, we would have given him a care package, and that might have saved his life. Our eyes didn't see is referring to the fact that we didn't know he was leaving, because if we had known, we would have escorted him outside of the town and made sure he got onto the right road. Meaning to say, the reason that he may have been killed is that he took a wrong turn. He went into a forest. He went into a place that was dangerous. If he had better directions, if he had better directions, then he may not have ended up being killed. So the Sanhedrin, like the members of the court, are saying, we didn't know about this. If we had known, we would have taken care of him. So it's kind of something about Yaakov also. You know, Yaakov sent Yosef into a very dangerous situation, sent him to brothers who literally hated him to death. And in hindsight, if Yaakov had known, he wouldn't have sent him without his own escort or something like that to make sure that nothing would have happened. So there's a similar parallel. But the Rebbe gives a spiritual twist to this. And he talks about the spiritual meaning of a person who is dead in between cities. If we look at it from a spiritual perspective, death does not necessarily mean physical death. Death can be referring to spiritual death. Because just like when a person physically dies, his soul leaves his body. So you're left with a vacuum, an emptiness of spirituality, which was the soul in the body, so too a person might spiritually die. They might have a vacuum of holiness in their life. Instead of having a life that is full of soul and meaning and purpose, they could lose that meaning and that purpose, and they could be like the walking dead, as people sometimes say. So they're just living a life, but it's kind of a shell without inner content and meaning. And why is this? This is because the person is in the field. A field is an uncivilized place, a place where there are wild animals, which connotes negative forces. Being in the city represents being amongst civilized people. Spiritually, that means being amongst good company, people who are a good example, a community where you live amongst friends who are doing the right thing, trying to do the right thing, helping each other do the right thing. And there the person doesn't die because he's in the cradle of the community. But when he goes out to the field, which means when he goes out to a place of spiritual desolation, when he goes out to situations where there are negative influences, where he doesn't have good people around him, showing him, caring for him, helping him, and so on, this could lead to a spiritual downfall. And that's the spiritual meaning of the person found dead in between the city. And what does the Sanhedrin have to do? What do the judges have to do? They have to say, you know what? If we would have known, we would have escorted him. If we would have known, we would have given him a care package. What they're saying is, if we would know that this person is going to a place of spiritual danger, we would have given him a spiritual care package. We would have given him inspiration. We would have given him guidance. We'd have instructed him how to be able to deal with all the negative influences and forces that might come across him. And we wouldn't have let him go without an escort. We would have seen to it that there should be somebody along with him in this dangerous place who can give him chizuk, who can give him inspiration. You know, they have a policy in one of the Hasidic communities. I forget which one it is. Perhaps it's Ger, where they're very organized. So, you know, sometimes kids drop out of yeshiva. Not all kids are cut out to study in yeshiva all day. And sometimes kids don't drop out, but they are forced out because they're not behaving and they're a bad influence onto others. And the yeshiva has to ask them to leave. So that's like a really scary situation spiritually. Here's a boy who until now was totally in the cradle of the yeshiva, totally immersed in the right thing. At least he was able to be immersed. Maybe he wasn't making use of it, but mostly. And then you're expelling him and you're sending him out into the wild yonder. Who knows what he's going to do with his life? So in this particular Hasidic group, the policy is they never expel a student unless there's an older person, not the parent, because oftentimes kids who are expelled, maybe they're not getting along with their parents and the relationship is not so good. There has to be an older person who is going to take this boy or girl, for that matter, this person under their wing and make sure that they are cared for and, you know, physically, spiritually, you know, nourished and they don't just end up, you know, literally living in the streets. So this is what the Sanhedrin says. If we had known that this person was going into a dangerous spiritual situation, we would have done something about it to make sure he shouldn't end up dying, so to speak, spiritually dying. And this is the meaning of what Yosef is sending back to his father. I went into a spiritual desert. I went into the field. I had to deal with wild beasts. That's referring, of course, to the wife of Potiphar, who tried to seduce him, and many other situations that we don't read about in the text. But obviously, living in Egypt, which is a place of moral decadence, there's no question he had all kinds of, negative influences around him. Yet, he was still studying that portion, meaning to say he had managed to remain connected. He was not that, corpse found in the field. He had managed to remain spiritually alive despite his being in the field. This was the message that Yosef was sending to Yaakov. I should pause for questions because I'm talking for a long time.
I'm a little bit surprised that knowing his children, and I'm sure he saw Jacob, he saw so many signs of them lying and being extremely jealous to their brother, that he did not anticipate the situation. This is number one thing. The second one is that he actually could be blamed for that very much, because he constantly put Joseph on a pedestal, which creates definitely a jealousy and feeling of, bad feelings from other siblings, especially in a family where there are, several mothers. That's it's it's definitely a relationship, but maybe not as strong as it is in one family. That's why it is a really big surprise to me that the person who was actually was like a prophet, someone who saw the future so many times, couldn't see it right under his own nose. I'm sorry, it's just maybe a little too plain explanation, but both of them really made me very surprised.
Right. So as far as the prophecy of Yaakov, sometimes you can see other people's problems and you can diagnose other people's illnesses, but you cannot diagnose your own. That's something that doctors are told not to do. Don't diagnose yourself and don't diagnose your loved ones, because there's too much emotion involved to be able to make a rational, intellectual decision. So Yaakov was very bright, of course, very holy, certainly, but his love for his own family obviously blinded him somewhat and did not allow him to see how deep the issues were. Obviously, he knew there were issues between Yosef and the brothers, because they complained to him and Yosef told the dreams and didn't like the dreams. That's clear in the text. So he knew there were issues, but he obviously did not realize the depth of those issues. But that being said, I want to point out the Talmud does not give him a pass. The Talmud says we have to learn from his mistake and not show favoritism. You're writing your wills. Everybody should have a will. Hopefully, I haven't written mine yet, but hopefully in a good time I will. And when you write your will, try as much as possible to be fair, 100% fair, 100% equal. Don't show favoritism even in little small things, because you never know what could spark jealousy. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Jacob actually didn't blame the brothers for the bad blood between Joseph and his brothers. He blamed Joseph. And he told them, that his dreams are wrong, that he's talking about what he's talking about.
That's true. Joseph was also to blame.
He didn't feel that the brothers might kill him or do something to him.
Obviously
He
not.
thought
If he had known that, he would never.
Joseph is the perpetrator of trouble here. So he sent him to look, he didn't worry about it.
Right. He obviously did not realize how bad the hatred was. Otherwise, he would never have sent him.
Right.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so we have to answer all these questions. So the special accomplishment of Yosef was twofold. First of all, that he did not fall as a result of him being in the field, but more so, that he actually managed to thrive in Egypt, to spiritually thrive, and even to influence the Egyptians in a spiritual way. And this was something that was even beyond Yaakov's ability. Yaakov had been in a stressful situation, a spiritually stressful situation with Lavan, and he managed to survive spiritually, but the ability to actually transform a negative place and turn it into a more positive place, that was something that was unique about Yosef and Yosef's accomplishment. And that's why there are two breaks, because both of these breaks want to emphasize these two accomplishments. Looking back at verse 7 and 8, which is broken up by the Shlishi break, by the break of the third Aliyah. Vayishlacheni Elokim lefnechem lasum lachem sheretz v'oros al hachis lachem lepleita gedola. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So that's about surviving. That's about maintaining. And verse 8 is not just about surviving, but it's about thriving. That Hashem has made me a father to Parai, a master over his house, and a ruler in Egypt, meaning to say, not only was I not affected by Egypt, but I'm influencing Egypt. That's a whole nother level. Going down to verse 27 and 28, first he sees the wagons, which is referring to the Egla Arufa and the lesson from the dead body. He was not like that dead person. He had remained spiritually alive. And the next verse is Rav. Rav means a lot. A lot means Rav od Yosef ben Ichai. My son is a lot alive. He's even more alive than I was. He managed to thrive spiritually, not just to survive. And that's why we break up the parashiyos to emphasize these two levels that Yosef achieved. All right, I had to cram it in at the end over there, but I hope that it's clear.
Rabbi, minor point, going back to the introductory portion of your presentation.
Yes.
Isn't the Targum written in Aramaic originally? I know it's been translated into Hebrew, but wasn't it originally in Aramaic?
Absolutely. The Targum is written in Aramaic, and that's what they used to use to translate every verse. In between every verse, they would read the Targum Onkelos, which is the Aramaic translation of the Torah.
Thank you.
Sure. Rashi draws upon that translation often in his interpretation. All right. I wish you all a wonderful
Oh, I
rest of
just
the
saw
week.
another one.
Rabbi, can you give us a 1 or 2 minute takeaway?
1 or 2 minute takeaway. I'm on overtime here. I don't want to cut into
Yes,
the
I know.
class. But the 1 or 2 minute takeaway is that Yosef managed to accomplish something unique, which impressed his father Yaakov immensely, which was that not only was he able to maintain his spiritual level amid spiritual diversity, which was something that the forefathers had managed to do and Yaakov had managed to do, so he was bearing their torch in a sense, but he accomplished something unique, something new that had not ever been accomplished until his time, which just goes to show the next generation can be, even better than the previous generation. He had managed to take the place of impurity and turn it somewhat into a more pure place, managed to civilize it somewhat, make it more spiritual by being their leader, by being an example for them. And this is something the Torah portion emphasizes by breaking up these two levels into two, and something that we should take an example from in our own lives, not just to spiritually thrive in difficult situations, but to even try to influence others and transform those situations.
Thank you, Rabbi
Rabbi.
Citron.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Really.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
My pleasure. All the best.
Good day, everybody.
Hanukkah.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.